thank you all again for taking the time and joining us here. We have a very interesting guest, Anna Scotti. She and I were on campus for a couple of quarters at the same time. We probably saw each other, in the CAF or on the student union or something.
Yeah.
She is a very accomplished poet and author. So I think that hopefully some of the time that Anna spent in Yellow Springs contributed to her creativity. When were you on, Anna? When were you on campus?
I started in the fall of '74, and Duffy is quite right. I was 15, and I graduated on the 5-year plan, which back then was kind of a joke we told for students like me who couldn't finish in 4 years. But now I think it's pretty well accepted. A lot of students do it in 5. Mm-hmm. So I finished in June of '79, June of '80.
Yeah. Were you really 15 when you started?
I was. I had applied to a number of schools and was accepted everywhere I applied, but Antioch was the only school that said I could come immediately and not take a year, which no such thing as a gap year then. They just said you have to wait a year until you're older. So I chose Antioch, and it worked out well. I'm glad I did.
Did you go into did you enter knowing that you were interested in writing? Were you an early writer?
Well, kind of funny. I put on my application that I wanted to be a journalist. But the reason I put that was I didn't know what a journalist was. I thought it meant a novelist. And so I ended up being a novelist and at one point also a journalist. But my main interest in Antioch and where I did most of my co-ops was in science, in biological science and also social sciences. So I had a very interesting co-op at the National Institutes of Health in NINCDS, which is the Neurological and Infectious Diseases, working for a guy named Carlton Yajasek, who had won the Nobel Prize. And he was working on what he was calling slow viruses. He was studying a disease called scrapie. Most people now have heard of mad cow. Mad cow and scrapie are basically the same thing. And he ended up, he won the Nobel Prize for studying Kuru, which was the first prion disease that was identified. But he was an interesting man. He ended up going to prison for some crimes related to pedophilia. And when he was in prison, he was so important in studying AIDS that his work and his ideas were essential to people around the world who were studying AIDS in laboratories, HIV. So they let him actually entertain visiting scientists from other countries in the prison conference room when he was in prison. So he was a colorful guy, but I had that. I liked that co-op so much that I ended up working at the NIH for about 1.5 years. And when I had to wait almost a year to graduate, I finished my courses and I wanted to move to California, but I didn't want to move to California and not be able to come back and walk. So I was killing time, and I ended up taking a job there for 1.5 years. And it was a good experience.
Did you go to California then?
I did. I went to California with the idea that I was going to be a movie star. And so once again, you're going to see a pattern in my life. I moved to San Francisco because I didn't realize there was really a difference between San Francisco and Los Angeles. So I got mired in San Francisco for about 5 years and went to graduate school in business, and I was modeling. I was a model at that point, and I did get to do some fun background and walk-ons and bit parts in movies. And then I ended up heading down to LA finally after that.
Did you have a big breakthrough here in LA?
Mm-mm.
No. No.
I did not. What happened was what's a bit of a colorful story, but to make it short, I ended up abandoning my acting career because I was stalked. And the person that was stalking me, that person ended up being the criminal that California's first anti-stalking law was based upon, for his crimes against someone else that he stalked. He was a serial stalker. And I ended up getting into the writing end of my brain, I guess. Instead of acting, I decided to try writing. But the whole time I was at Antioch, I had thought I would pursue a career in science. I had another really interesting co-op I had was working for the Cybernetics Research Institute in Washington, where they were just starting to experiment with myoelectrics, like putting a myoelectric on someone's mouth or eye so that they could manipulate a keyboard and communicate if they were paralyzed. And now those kinds of things are widely used. People who are paralyzed can, type with one finger or even with an eye by blinking. But at that time, it was just being developed. So
Yeah, I just read on the internet now that there's one person who thinks about writing in cursive, right? And his thoughts of writing the letters are transferred into a communication. So
isn't that remarkable?
It's so remarkable.
It's just incredible. At this time, that was, what are we talking, 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. It was a big deal to be able to get a regular, correcting selectric to type about 30 words a minute just with two fingers or by blinking. That was considered pretty incredible. So the strides we've made since then are just unbelievable.
Well, I see that there is a theme in your life about writing, or at least an interest in communication. So what was your first publication? Was it
Oh gosh, it was a poem in a long defunct journal, and I was so excited about it, and it was a pretty good poem. But I don't think I published another poem for 30 years. I wrote some books pseudonymously. I ghost wrote some books that for scientists who were trying to present their work to a more general publication. And then I got into magazine writing. And I ended up writing for what were then the big 7 women's magazines, which some of them I think are defunct now. There was Red Book and Ladies Home Journal and McCall's, those magazines. And I specialized in 2 things. I wrote Disease of the Month and I wrote True Crime. So they would send me out on a story. One of my best stories was this guy named Doug Pugh, who he was a Navy SEAL who faked his own death and ended up remarrying and starting a new life after abandoning his family and the Navy. And the interesting thing was that when he was caught, his 2 wives were nearly identical in appearance. The judge at the trial couldn't tell them apart. And then I would also write stories about people who had rare diseases or adoptions gone bad, that kind of story. So very emotionally draining kinds of stories. So I ended up becoming one of the original writers and editors for InStyle, which has become very, very popular, very successful since it was launched. I was in the early issues, and I was a foreign correspondent for People magazine down in Australia. But in Australia, it's not called People because People is the name of a dirty men's magazine. So it's called Who Weekly down there. So I was the foreign correspondent for Who Weekly, and I used to remember, this is pre-internet, so I used to sit in my living room and watch the awards shows, the Oscars, and talk into my phone as if I were really there watching them, and they would be broadcasting me. So that was kind of fun.
Sort of Hollywood interpreter, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you consider yourself a poet or a novelist or what? I know you've just published your collection of
Hmm.
books,
I
of
have. I'll
poems.
show it to you. This
I
is.
did pre-order one.
Did you
It
order? You
hasn't got
didn't get it yet?
no. Well, I'm traveling now, so hopefully it's waiting for me when I get
It's
home.
probably waiting for you. They did a pretty good job of getting them out. It's called
Mhm,
Bewildered by All This Broken Sky, and it won
mhm.
the first Light Scatter Press Prize. And it took me a long time. I've been publishing poetry for quite a while. I've been contributing to the New Yorker for 5 years now, but I just didn't quite have it together to form a collection. I didn't a good collection of poetry isn't just kind of a box that holds all the poems you've written. It's got to have a sort of a theme or a thread at least running through it. Um, so I finally approached this publisher and I won a prize and they published the book. But I found something really cool in the book after it was published, which is on many pages, not all, there are little QR codes.
Oh,
And you can
uh-huh.
scan your phone over them and they take you to little pieces of art and music that was commissioned to go with my poems in the book. So
I've never seen that
I
before.
think it's the first time they've done it for
What a
poetry anyway.
what a
But
great idea.
I am a poet, but I'm also I wrote, I'll show you, I've got all my little books stacked up here. I published Big and Bad last year. It's a
Mhm.
young adult novel,
Yeah, it's
and
doing quite well on Amazon, I saw. Uh-huh.
it's doing pretty well. Yeah, it just won a prize. It won the Patterson Prize for best young adult book uh, of 2020, and that was very gratifying because I wrote this book 18 years ago,
Mhm.
16 years before it was purchased, and I had really given up on ever publishing it. I just stuck it in a drawer. I wrote it and I didn't know what to do with it. So I contacted a couple of companies and said, hey, do you want to publish my book? And they said no. And I said, okay, bye.
Mhm.
Just didn't know what to do. But I came across it and I liked it. And so I freshened it up because it was 16 years old when I
Sure.
dug it out of this drawer.
Mhm.
And I freshened it up and entered it in a contest and it didn't win. It came in second, but the
Mhm.
publisher asked if they could publish it anyway because they liked it. And so I think about that a lot. I teach writing. I teach school to children.
Mhm.
I teach 12-year-olds, but I also teach writing to adults. And I use that story a lot to remind people that are in the creative arts. It can be a long road to
Long road, yeah.
any
Mhm.
kind of success
Right.
whatsoever.
And sometimes insurmountable odds. I was looking through the New Yorker and read some interviews and like the number of submissions they get in a year is just and from all kinds of people
Mhm,
who should be published and they just don't get
mhm.
a chance. So you must have some.
It's amazing. I the editor who first published me at the New Yorker is Paul Muldoon. He's not
uh,
there anymore.
no.
Now Kevin Young is the poetry editor. And I
Mhm.
got really lucky to find two in a row that my
Yes.
work connected with. But I really liken it to, I know many poets better than I am who have not published in the New Yorker, although they've tried hard.
Mhm.
And I think it's a matter of a lot of things, but one of them is just connecting with that editor. And there's a degree of chance in it. It's sort of like throwing a bottle into the ocean.
Yeah.
And Paul Muldoon leaned out of his cruise ship and picked up my bottle.
Uh-huh.
So I
Well,
got lucky there.
yeah, being at the right place and the right time,
Mhm.
or just
But
even
once again, what's that saying, Peter, about preparation? Luck is preparation meets opportunity. You know,
true.
you have to be lucky to find the opportunity, but when the opportunity is there, you have to be prepared with
Sure.
something worthy to, take advantage.
Right. And you have to take the first step too, right?
Mhm.
The
Hmm.
draft is just getting it down, something down on paper to correct later.
So true. You're
Uh-huh.
absolutely right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You know, so I have to admit that in high school, I liked poetry, because we probably had it in English class and, Robert Frost and Langston Hughes and
Hmm. Yep.
all well-known poets. But I have to say that, I had a subscription to the New Yorker, for example, for a number of years, and I'd see a poem and I just turn the page, you know,
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
I just scan it
Hmm.
and turn the page and now I'm a few years older and a smidgen wiser, um, and I think actually just thinking about talking to you and knowing that finding out that you were a poet, I started looking back and saying, well, what I think poetry is very important. And I think that it takes time to read poetry, right? I
Hmm.
mean, I'm
Hmm.
such, like I've said in my email, I'm a very fast reader. Boy, I can read and very high comprehension. And I can see a poem and it's like 30 words, 40 words, zip. Okay, that's about 3 seconds. And I realize now it's sort of like a mindfulness training, right? Is that
Hmm. Hmm.
sit back and and take a minute, really, because another thing that you wrote, or in some of maybe on your blog or something, is that you spend a lot of time picking the right words, right? Um, and so it's almost like a disservice to someone who just flips the page, right? So I think everyone should find a poem, and just take a second and read a poem, just take not a second, take 5 minutes and read the same poem or so. I mean, what do you recommend to
I
people?
think you're onto something. I also am a page flipper. I often come across a poem and don't like the looks of it, and I just move on. And
Mhm.
sometimes I do read every poem that appears in the New Yorker because I want to be able to make kind of bitter comments about how I had something better that they should have run.
I
But
do submit captions to their comics. There are
mhm,
probably some other
yep,
people on.
yep,
Never one, even though I'm always
no,
the best. And when they ask me to vote, not funny, not funny, not funny. But
right.
anyway, no, I'm sorry, I didn't. Yeah, so you
We all
see.
do that. But I think the page flipping is very normal, and sometimes you're not in the mood to read a poem,
Mhm.
but it is a useful thing to go back and really focus on one poem and read it slowly, maybe read it several times and think, because it does, you mentioned mindfulness, and it reading a poem does force you to slow down. There's no point to speed reading one or
Right,
skimming one. It
sure.
forces you to slow down and concentrate.
Hmm.
So
Sure.
yeah. Mhm.
So the New Yorker, we've mentioned them for, we're not associated at all with them. All you probably get a stipend for every time you mention them. But uh, what other, what other journals or
Well,
what other sources of poems are there out there in the world?
there are a lot of places to read poetry. There are thousands of little literary journals. Every university has one. Antioch has one that's quite well respected, the Antioch Review. They're not publishing right now because of the pandemic, but I think they're getting started up again soon.
Mhm.
And these little journals can really use the support of the public if you want to subscribe to one. But the New Yorker is the definitive source for kind of seeing what's new in poetry and what's not necessarily new, but what's valued and respected right now.
Mhm.
They're never the first to grab something new, and they're never the last to give up something old. So you can kind of see what's happening right now.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, and you can get everything they publish online for free. You can just go and look. There's
I,
also Poem a Day, which is a free source. You can have a poem delivered to your inbox and your email every single day.
oh, that's nice. Everyone write. Can someone put that in the chat? A poem a day, huh?
Poem a Day, yeah. I just had a Poem a Day published by the San Francisco Public Library. They published my poem, Feathers of Gold, which was really fun. But the real poem a day, the big one, is published by the Academy of Writers. Hold on, I'll put it in there. But if you just, there's also Poem 180, which is 180 poems. So I guess it's one every other day. And there's some great stuff in there. But you know, I don't just write poetry and young adult novels. I also write sort of at the other end of the spectrum. I write a lot for Ellery Queen.
I can't believe that magazine is still in business. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, they're doing
I
strong.
have, yeah, I probably
Yeah,
have a copy from the 1960s someplace, you know.
if you do, it might be worth something. Ellery Queen and Alfred Hitchcock, which is the sister publication, Ellery Queen is the oldest and most respected mystery magazine in the world, but they've both been publishing. They have the same offices and different editors, but very similar magazines. And they've published a lot of real heavyweight, you know, John Steinbeck and Joyce Carol Oates, and all the way up to, you know, Stephen King and Maya Angelou. But they are going strong. Now, they don't have anything like the circulation of the New Yorker, but I think they have about 50, 60,000 print subscribers, which is pretty good. And I write two things for them. I write standalone stories that are just exactly that, you know, one-off. And then I write a series about a librarian who's on the run in witness protection. And those are the Cam Baker mysteries. And I've had some film people nosing around about them. So I'm kind of excited about that, thinking maybe something could happen. They'll turn my girl Cam Baker into a movie heroine, I hope.
Well, yeah, I think you have to be careful with that because, you know, they'll have 3 car chases, 2 love interests, and you know, they'll take your story and run with it.
You know, they can. They just have to show me the money. That's fine.
Because there was another person from Arizona who has a similar. She's written some books about her life history as being a doctor to you might know her, a doctor to the Navajo Indian tribes, and she's published 2 books. And looking to turn them into a film or a TV. But boy, see what American television does with a Native American story, unless you're going to like PBS or so.
Well, we'll see. It could be interesting. There's a lot of good stuff on television these days with all the cable channels.
Well, yeah, there's so many more platforms, so many more screens to fill. It's not just 3 studios and you know 5 fat white men, you know, making all the decisions. So
well, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
So what do you, I mean, if you were to sit down, how do you start writing? I mean, what's your, do you just like wake up from a dream and say write down some notes? How do you start a story? How do you start a poem? I guess it doesn't matter what, you know, do you sit down and say, I'm going to write a poem?
I think probably the most common, and I know there are a couple of writers here right now in this presentation. I think the most common question we get asked is a form of what you asked, which is, where do you get your ideas? And it's a question that sort of flummoxes me, because I sort of feel like, well, what do you do with your ideas? You know, because I think that we all have a lot of ideas that cross our mind constantly. You know, you're standing in line at the 7-Eleven to buy a hot dog or a carton of milk, and the guy in front of you buys a lottery ticket, and you start thinking, you know, what if I won the lottery? Or what if this guy gives the ticket to his mother and she wins the lottery and won't share the money? And then there's this, you know, and I think we all are constantly looking at alternate realities. You know, we see a dog run down the street and we think about catching it, and then we don't catch it, we do catch it, or a woman runs out and catches it before we can, and you see all the could have beens.
Mhm.
I think the difference for writers is that we just have that drive to maybe put it down in words,
Mhm.
what all of us are thinking all the time. And you know, I teach writing, and it's kind of a false profession, because we have, you know, in order to get paid to teach writing, you have to teach something. You can't
Sure.
just do what people really need to hear who want to write, which is sit down and write. Just, you
Mhm.
know, put your
Right.
hands on the keyboard and start writing. So there's all kinds of, you know, language that has come up about writing with story arcs and conflict and character development. And I don't even know what all of that really means. To me, I just think of something that could have happened but didn't happen.
Mhm.
And if it seems pretty interesting, then I write it down, and then there's a story.
So you don't have like 100 post-it notes and you sort of move them around and say, oh, I got to develop this character, so I'll put it over here. Goes
I
down.
do have a thousand post-it notes, but not like that.
No.
Not like you're talking about structure wise. Mine are just all things like, my favorite one is on my bathroom mirror now. I'll never move it because I took a yellow post-it and I wrote in bright red marker, "Don't forget." And that's all I wrote. And I still don't know what it was for. but no, I don't do that thing. But some writers do that. They have the
Mhm.
storyboard and the post-its, and they're moving things. And I just try to keep it straight in my head.
Mhm. Well, I guess you must be naturally talented to have it come up because, just a story, a snippet, it's probably missing character development and the third act and then a resolution, which I think people sort of expect in a movie otherwise, or a story.
Maybe
Otherwise,
more so. I think a film has a much tighter structure it has
yeah,
to
maybe.
follow. To me, a story or a novel or a short story, what you need is an interesting character that
Mhm.
people care about, whether they love the character or hate the character. They have to care. And then something interesting has to happen to that person.
Mhm.
And really, the world is so exciting and fascinating and interesting that if you portray it accurately, how could you not interest your audience if you
Mhm.
really write down what's really all around you?
Yeah.
People are will be interested.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Well, so do your students, I mean, do you look at like the first assignment, or do the first assignment, I mean, what makes them improve, or do they improve just by taking a writing class? I mean, is there a
do
difference
improve.
from assignment 1 to assignment 10?
Yes.
Mhm.
And children improve more quickly than
Mhm.
adults, because the best way for me, just my opinion, a million people would tell you I'm wrong. But
Mhm.
for me, the most important thing to teach writers is writing mechanics, how to actually write correct, accurate sentences that convey meaning.
Yeah.
And it's easier for children to improve because they start out with a lot of creativity, but maybe not much ability to form
Mhm.
those sentences. Whereas adults already have a way of thinking and speaking that they've developed, and they're often kind of stuck.
Mhm.
Um, so it's easier to teach than to reteach, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So Paul Muldoon, the poetry editor, he had a quote where he thought that um, that children were, let me paraphrase it, where children were very good at poetry between the ages of, let's say, 5 and 10, because they
Hmm.
were just experiencing language and playing with language. And
Hmm.
I thought, well, that's not too far off from 10 to 15, when you're in high school and you're learning, or at least I was learning about poetry, and I really, really like that, how rearranging words and playing with the structure,
Hmm.
could and could convey an incredible amount of emotion or meaning, just because it's rearranged differently. And maybe as an adult, it's always like subject, verb, predicate. The structure is always this way, and that's how you write this sentence. And that's yeah.
Well, it's a balance between, I think for writers, it's a balance between creativity and structure, because unbounded creativity is boring. Someone just, there are very few, Jasper Johns in the world throwing paint at a canvas and making it something.
Yeah, I tried that. That's not very easy to do.
No. And so creativity that's just stream of consciousness babbling everything out of your mouth, that's not going to interest anyone.
No.
On the other hand, being so tightly buttoned up that you're focused on every sentence being perfect, grammatically correct, is the other end of the spectrum. So you've got to find a way to find a balance in there between creativity and structure. But to me, structure is the part that often gets neglected. A lot of people who want to write aren't willing to put in the time to edit, which is really what writing is. It's editing.
I thought that's mankind's greatest urge, is to edit.
Maybe edit other people's stuff.
Edit other people's work. That's what it is.
Yeah.
So, I wonder if we have any questions. Sometimes, I don't know, Jesse, have you been following the chat at all? Are there any questions that are coming up? Maybe if some people want to post some questions in the chat. I've
been looking, Peter, I've been glancing at the chat, and I noticed Jonathan had to leave because of the fires. We've got some pretty bad fires in Pacific Palisades right now.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it kept a couple of my friends from attending today, and the winds are picking up. So it's a little bit of a bad situation here in LA. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, every place in LA is very dry.
Yeah, we're heading into a bad season again.
Sure.
That's right. Yep.
All right. But good. So if there are people in the audience who would like to ask a question.
I think Charles Rosenberg has his hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Charles. I think you have to unmute yourself. I don't know if Jesse.
I'm unmuted, I think.
Yes, thank you.
So I recently updated a draft of a novel I wrote about 10 years ago, and I found I had to update the technology in it. And I was curious whether you had the same experience. There was no Twitter, Facebook wasn't, nobody texted. And it
how old was your novel that you were updating? When
it was about 10 years old.
Oh my gosh, and everything has changed.
And then I actually went through it and marked every place. Well, for example, somebody was answering a telephone, and I thought, well, why didn't somebody just call her phone, her cell phone?
Yeah.
And so it took and it was really an interesting process to just remind myself that in only 10 years, there's been a huge sea change.
It's been huge, Charles. I dusted off a script that I wrote and was revamping it, and realized that the kids in the script didn't have cell phones. And there were several instances where someone reading it would go, well, why didn't they have a phone? Why didn't they just have a cell phone?
Yeah.
And I ended up going the opposite direction from what you did. I didn't update it. I moved it backwards a little bit and placed my story in the early 90s so that I didn't have to deal with that. But
well, this novel is set 20 years in the future, so I didn't really have any choice.
You had to, yeah. But, on the other hand, you can make up anything you want for 20 years.
But you have to be careful about that. But I also rewatched Mad Men recently, and there was one scene in which Peggy has put up a notice on the bulletin board looking for a roommate, and then somebody calls her on her office phone, and I thought, why didn't they call her cell phone? Oh, she didn't have one. Right? So,
that's right.
It's really a vast sea change. So.
That's right. And you have to, I think, for me, I have to talk to someone who was around in each era that I write about. Like, remember how there was a kind of a narrow window when everyone got these machines. They got like actual answering machines. They became cheap and everybody had one. They were no longer just something that offices had. But then they were quickly superseded by voicemail with no machine interface. And I think that was just like an 80s thing. Maybe the early 80s people had answering machines.
Well, I wrote a novel set in 1780, and it took me a long time to wrap my head around the fact that people couldn't instantly communicate in any way, shape, or form. There wasn't even a telegraph, and that it took days and weeks to get anywhere. 78. And so the time really matters to that sort of stuff. So
I think letters were sometimes months or even years in the arriving.
Right.
Depending
well,
on
it's like Lord North didn't find out that the British had lost the major battle of the Revolutionary War until several months after it took place.
Wow, amazing.
He got a note at a dinner party. Spoiled his dinner party. So.
See, that historical fiction takes a lot of research. It does. Maybe that's why I haven't dabbled yet. It am I correct about that?
Oh yeah, it does. But it's fun to do because you're constantly discovering people who you didn't know about who were very important. Although sometimes it's a little depressing in this sense. You read about people who, bestrode the earth like giants, and they're not only dead, they're forgotten. And their children are dead, and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren are dead. And it just reminds you that almost everyone disappears. Right?
Dust we art.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very true.
But when you look at like that genealogy program on PBS, I'm always amazed at the volumes of paperwork, documenting people's lives. And they go into these, libraries, and they pull out this book from the 1700s, that shows, who died on that day. There just must be reams and reams of paper that are hundreds of years old. And I think that, the genealogists probably do the best job there is of transferring that into some digital format. But can you just imagine how much stuff is in France in their archives there, or even here in the United States in the capital?
Well, I was just reading a book, and I can't remember the name. Maybe someone else has read it, but it was fiction, but it was referring to the fact that there are big storehouses full of old documents in Israel, because nothing that has God's name on it can be destroyed. You can't, or it's a very difficult process to destroy writing that has God's name on it. So there are big storehouses of just random papers and documents that are mostly worthless, but there could be something incredibly historically valuable in there. And we're moving beyond that now. How many pictures do you have printed that are from any time after the 90s? I stopped printing pictures around 1995, and everything's on the computer now, but it's easy to lose.
Yeah, it's easy to lose. And then you sort of realize there is with your kids or with your family, oh, I don't have a digital picture of that. That's in some box. And I'm lucky. I saved all my photographs from Antioch, put them on the web there.
Yeah.
But there's a real demarcation. So I do see that Robert Goldsmith, class of 76. So we might know who Robert is.
I know Bob Goldsmith. Yeah.
Oh, great. So Bob, you've got a question?
I have a comment. We're talking, well, I was trying to interject earlier, but you were talking about getting a story in the historical context. And I usually don't read much fiction, but one book I read, which impressed me when it was written, was by Erica Jong, Fanny. Do you know the book, Anna?
I know the writer, but I didn't read the book.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's a great story. And the other bonus, and this is the reason for mentioning it, it took place, it's about a female pirate.
Mm-hmm.
And great story. And what also makes it an excellent story is her research on the period. And the reason she knows the period so well is she did her PhD on the history of not the history, life during that period. I guess it would be 1600.
Yeah.
So it's a great, it's fiction, but it's a great story. And then the story is well integrated in how life was during that period, and it makes it more fascinating because of her wealth of knowledge regarding the period.
She's an amazing writer. She got somewhat pigeonholed with the one book, you know, Fear of Flying.
Yeah, I read it.
So shocking and fun when it came out, but and I loved it. I think everybody did when it came out, but I think a lot of her other stuff hasn't been widely read, and she's very good.
Well, this one, Anna, I have a confession to make. I really don't like poetry. The only person well, let me finish a confession. The only poetry I ever really enjoyed was by Erica Jong.
Well, good.
Because it verged on erotica.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I like
they're always limericks.
But independent of that, I recommend you reading the book.
Definitely. Well, you're not alone in not enjoying poetry. Most people don't. Poetry has a very small audience. Yeah. But we're an elite audience. So yeah. Maybe you'll stumble across.
I don't even read much fiction. It's mainly history that I tend to read. Mm-hmm. And a little bit of economics.
Yep. Yeah.
Sarah has her hand up. Sarah.
Hi. Sally. It's actually Sally Ann. I was going to say, I think you're wrong about poetry if you are willing to acknowledge that much music is poetry. And poetry, historically, of course, was sung, particularly in Japan and China and Asia. But if you think of, think of rap. I mean, that's poetry.
Yeah.
Easily seen as poetry.
Well, I think all song lyrics are poetry. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're right. That is it's popular. Yeah.
I think that what has happened for many people is the idea of poetry has become the idea of music.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah.
In terms of lyrics, that's why the Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to a songwriter. So you didn't like that? I thought it was.
I thought it was insulting. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, but he didn't deserve the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Did you think some other songwriter did, but no songwriter? Okay.
Nope. I think it was lovely to acknowledge him. He's a great guy. He's contributed a lot, blah, blah, blah. There are others on a par with him, but I feel like the Nobel Prize maybe should go to one of the higher forms of our art. And, I am writing at both ends of the spectrum. So, I don't have a dog in the fight, but I thought it was kind of insulting.
We could argue about what's higher, though.
We could.
Yeah. So.
We could. But anyway.
I don't know. I think Bob Dylan could be considered a poet.
He's a poet, as what Sally was pointing out is that all songwriters are poets, and I'm also a songwriter. So when I win my Nobel, I want it to be for literature or poems, not for my country music song. I guess I'll take it if they hand it to me, but
there's always Emmys out there too, right?
Yeah, so, there you go. That's right.
As long as it's recognition. Well, great. Joan. Yes, Joan.
I want to ask you a question about the Antioch Review. I subscribe to the Antioch Review, and there's a lot of poetry in it and other. And I just was wondering if you have any honest comments about the selection process and how things get into the Antioch Review. I don't always feel that they're at the same level of worth, should I say?
It's uneven, isn't it?
Mhm.
I think I've noticed the same thing you're talking about, and the quality of what they publish is uneven. The Antioch Review has a very good reputation. It's one of the, if we listed the top 40 markets for poets that poets aspire to, it's in the top 30, 40. But you know, what appears in magazines has to do with the choices of the editors, and it's subjective, not objective. So I try to, you know, one of the most respected journals for poetry is Poetry Magazine, and I don't like most of what they publish. Some of it's stellar, spectacular, but some of it.
Have you tried to publish in the Antioch Review?
No, I haven't, although I would love to publish in the Antioch Review. The reason I know they're not accepting right now is that I contacted them to see if they would write a review of my book, and thinking I would contribute some poems and they could do a review, but they're not up and running right now. So maybe that can happen soon, but I absolutely would be proud to see my work in their pages. Yeah.
So here's a question I forgot to ask. What makes a good poem in your opinion?
I don't know. You have
don't
to
know?
ask someone else. I do not know, because a lot of what is great doesn't appeal to me. You know, so again, it is just so subjective, and things that were great in their time maybe don't always hold up. You know, I love Dylan Thomas. I love Dylan Thomas, and I know he's quite out of fashion right now, and people don't respect his work anymore. They say it's trite. You know, I think he's spectacular. So it's all subjective, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess the Nobel Prize is subjective too. So
Of course it is. Absolutely it is. Yeah.
good.
It's only a prize. It's not the art itself.
Well, I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I think everyone in the audience really learned something, and maybe Robert will even pick up a poem the next time and say, you know, maybe I shouldn't just toss it offhand and disregard it, and take a couple of minutes, because someone put a lot of work into choosing those words. You know, they weren't just random AI generated words.
It's quite right, Peter. Someone worked hard on it. You know, go on the New Yorker site and listen to a couple of my poems. You might like them.
Yeah.
I read well. You know, you might not like them, and then you can just say, told you so.
Yeah.
But I put my website in the chat if anyone's interested, and I'd love to hear from old Antioch friends and new friends as well.
I would like to add that Jim Morrison and Leonard Cohen.
Leonard Cohen might deserve the Nobel Prize.
Well,
maybe Leonard Cohen.
His writing in the term of songs, well, his poems in the form of songs were at its best in his latter years before he passed away.
Yeah, he was a beautiful writer, beautiful person, great
Joan.
work. Yeah.
Yeah, Joan.
And I was wondering if you might just conclude this nice party by reading one of your poems to us, so we have a sample of something that you like. But I also put in the chat that one of the poems I like the best is that I like very much is Eleanor Rigby, which is a beautiful poem.
It is a beautiful poem. I think to me, the test of a song lyrics are meant to be with music, but when they can stand alone just as words, then they're really something special, when they don't need them.
That's true of Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah.
But would you be good enough to pick a poem to read?
I'd love to read a poem if people want to stay and hear. I'll pick a short one. I'll pick a little short one. I'm guessing most of us here are parents. I'll read you a little poem I wrote about my daughter when she was a baby. and she learned to speak, and her first word was Baba Ya, which was a made-up word. Baba Ya, that first word that meant everything. Milk, sweet, warm, sing, and I need you desperately. And that first pair of shoes, hardly larger than marshmallows, with soles as soft and blameless as the skins of moles, or better, 2 white mice. Baba Ya, you, flouncing through the front hall in loose high heels, drugstore lipstick smeared across a mouth still bright with braces, sweet with milk. Thank you.
Thank you. Can't think of a better way to end the call today. So
bye, everybody. Please contact me if
Thanks,
you'd like.
Anna.
Thank
All
you
the
so much, Peter. Bye, y'all.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks, Peter. Great interview.